On there. Couldn't get any rest. And all our clothes were dirty. We were just smell like billy goats. Buddy had chartered this plane for me and him. When Buddy Holly's plane went down in 1959, the world mourned the loss of three rising stars. But for Waylon Jennings, who gave up his seat on that fateful flight, the crash was more than a tragedy. It was a lifelong burden. For years, he kept the details buried, pushing forward with a career that redefined country music. Yet, even at the height of his fame, the guilt never left him. At 64, Jennings finally opened up, sharing the haunting truth about that night and his part in it. The day music fell silent. By the late 1950s, Waylon Jennings had managed to do what most young West Texas musicians only dreamed of. He found himself stepping into a brand new sound. Something living right in the middle of rock and roll and country. And at the center of that musical explosion stood Buddy Holly, the sharp bespectacled kid from Locke who was rewriting the rules of popular music with hits like Peggy Sue. And that'll be the day. Holly spotted potential in Jennings right away. He believed Waylon had a voice that could carry him far. But there was one catch. Waylon didn't look the part. At the time, he was more likely to show up in the same shirt he'd worn all week than dressed for stardom. His radio colleagues often cringed at his rough around the edges style. But Buddy Holly saw past all that. He gave Waylon a makeover, cleaned him up, and gave him a little shine to match the raw talent. That was only the beginning. Holly wasn't just polishing an image. He was passing down a mindset. Jennings later said the biggest lesson he learned from Buddy Holly was attitude. Holly refused to let anyone tell him how to make his music. He followed his gut, never compromising his vision, and Jennings carried that same fierce independence into his own career. Years later, he admitted Holly was the first person who ever truly believed in him. Before that, Waylon felt he had about as much star power as an old shoe. Then came the turning point. Holly invited Jennings to join him on tour, a moment that would change everything. One day in 1959, Holly walked into the KLL radio studio where Waylon was working, handed him a bass guitar, and told him he had 2 weeks to learn it. The Winter Dance Party tour was about to begin, and Holly needed a band fast. The original Crickets were no longer with him, so he pulled together a new lineup. Tommy Alyap on guitar, Carl Bunch on drums, and Waylon on bass. Waylon threw himself into the challenge, playing Holly songs over and over until he had them down. He wasn't about to let his hero down. And he wasn't the only fresh face on the tour. Frankie Sardo, who had just scored his first hit with Fake Out, joined as one of the opening acts. Dion and the Belmonts, the Bronx doo-wop group already riding high off 3 top 40 hits, were also on the bill. Then there was Ritchie Valens, just 17 years old, but already a sensation thanks to La Bamba and Donna, records that had sold over 1 million copies. And rounding out the lineup was J.P. Richardson Jr., better known as the Big Bopper, riding the success of his smash Chantilly Lace. He was quickly becoming one of the biggest names in rock and roll. Together, this mix of big names and up-and-comers hit the road for the Winter Dance Party Tour. A show built to spread rock and roll to every corner of America. On January 23, 1959, the Winter Dance Party Tour kicked off in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The schedule put together by the booking agency GAC was grueling. 24 shows in 24 consecutive days with no breaks. But the pace of the tour wasn't the only problem. The buses the performers traveled in were little more than worn-out school buses. By the time the tour reached its 11th stop in Clear Lake, Iowa, they were already on their 5th replacement. None of the buses could handle the bitter Midwest winter, heaters barely worked. And one night, when a bus broke down in the middle of nowhere, the musicians resorted to burning newspapers just to stay warm. The conditions grew so severe that drummer Carl Bunch ended up in the hospital with frostbite on his feet. If that wasn't bad enough, the route itself was poorly planned. Instead of moving in a simple loop through the Midwest, the schedule sent them zigzagging across state lines. Some nights they traveled more than 400 m between shows, spending 10 to 12 hours on those freezing buses before stepping on stage. And when they finally arrived, there was no road crew waiting to help. The musicians had download, set up, and pack away all their own equipment night after night. The endless travel, sleepless nights, and freezing conditions wore them down. Before long, Buddy Holly, Richie Valens, and J.P. Richardson, the Big Bopper, all came down with flu-like symptoms. By February 2, when the tour bus finally rolled into Clear Lake, Iowa, Holly had reached his breaking point. They had just finished a 350 miles drive from Green Bay, and the next stop was another 365 miles away in Moorhead, Minnesota, a route that frustratingly passed through towns they had already played. Exhausted, sick, and desperate for clean clothes, Holly decided he couldn't take another brutal bus ride. It was then that he made a choice that would change music history forever. The tour reached Clear Lake, Iowa, just a couple of hours before showtime at the Surf Ballroom. By then, the musicians were worn down from endless miles on a freezing, unreliable bus. Buddy Holly had had enough. As soon as they arrived, he asked the ballroom manager, Carol Anderson, about chartering a plane. Anderson reached out to a local flight service and eventually found a young pilot named Roger Peterson, only 21 years old, who agreed to fly them to Fargo, North Dakota, the nearest airport, to their next stop in Moorhead, Minnesota. The plane, a small 1947 Beechcraft Bonanza, could carry 3 passengers and the pilot. Holly quickly booked it, eager for a break from the miserable bus rides. Tommy Alyapand and Jennings also pitched in $36 each to secure seats, hoping to finally get a warm night's rest in a hotel instead of shivering through another ride. Earlier that evening, Holly called home to speak with his wife, Maria, who was 6 months pregnant and had stayed behind on this tour at his insistence. After the show wrapped, 3 of the musicians headed to Mason City Municipal Airport. The plan was for Buddy Holly, Tommy Alup, and Waylon Jennings to take the flight. But by the end of the night, neither Alup nor Jennings boarded that plane. The Big Bopper, weighed down by the flu and his large frame, struggled to get comfortable on the cramped bus. Exhausted and sick, he pleaded for relief. Jennings, who could sleep anywhere, gave up his seat on the plane so the Bopper could stretch out in comfort. It seemed like a small act of kindness at the time, but it would save Jennings's life. Before parting ways, Holly and Jennings exchanged some good-natured trash talk about their travel arrangements. Holly teased that Jennings' bus might freeze up again, while Jennings jokingly shot back that Holly's plane might crash. Neither of them could have known just how haunting those words would become. Richie Valens also wasn't scheduled to be on the flight. At just 17, with hits like La Bamba and Donna propelling him to stardom, he too was exhausted from the brutal tour schedule. When he found out about Holly's charter, he began pushing hard for a seat. Tommy Alup resisted at first, but Valens kept asking until Alup finally agreed to settle it with a coin toss. Valens called heads. The coin landed in his favor, and just like that the seat was his. Alup later remembered Valens saying it was the first time he had ever won anything. That lucky flip of a $50 sealed his fate. Instead of Tommy Alup, it was Richie Valens who would climb aboard that small plane with Buddy Holly and the Big Bopper. The night of the flight was bleak from the very start. At Mason City Municipal Airport, the weather was reported as light snow with a low obscured sky. Winds whipped through at 20 to 30 miles per hour, and conditions were only expected to get worse along the route. Yet, none of this critical information was ever passed along to pilot Roger Peterson before takeoff. The plane lifted smoothly from the runway, but it wasn't long before the control tower lost contact. Winter weather quickly closed in with snow and low clouds cutting visibility down to almost nothing. Peterson was flying a small aircraft equipped only with an out-to-gyroscope system technology he wasn't fully trained to use. In those conditions, it was a recipe for disaster. When Hubert Dwyer, the owner of Dwyer Flying Service, realized he could no longer reach Peterson, he arranged for another plane to retrace the flight path. The search didn't take long. In the early hours, wreckage was discovered in a frozen cornfield owned by farmer Albert Jewell. The aircraft had slammed into the ground at an estimated 170 miles per hour. The crash was violent and the destruction made it clear no one could have survived. The bodies of the three musicians were thrown clear of the wreck, scattered nearby, while Peterson's body remained trapped in the twisted remains of the plane. All four lives were lost instantly on impact. That February morning in 1959 would forever be remembered as the day the music died. The day the world lost Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, and the Big Bopper. Three young stars whose voices were silenced far too soon. One struggles behind closed doors. Losing Buddy Holly in that tragic 1959 plane crash left a deep scar on Waylon Jennings, but he refused to walk away from music. He put together a rockabilly band called the Waylons, which soon became the house band at a Scottsdale, Arizona club named JD's. Around the same time, he started cutting records for a small label called Trent Records. Life at home, however, was far from stable. One night, Jennings came home late to a shocking sight. His wife, Maxine, was standing on a chair with a necktie looped around her neck, tied to a light bulb socket. As soon as he walked in, she jumped. The bulb shattered and she hit the floor, but Jennings didn't react with panic. He brushed it off as part of her strange sense of humor. Though both of them knew their marriage was crumbling. Despite the chaos, they continued to grow their family. In 1960, their third child was born, a son they named Buddy in memory of Holly. Jennings worked hard to provide for them, especially after Maxine's father fell seriously ill. The family moved to Arizona to be closer to him. While Jennings bounced between radio jobs, struggling to find a real break, nothing seemed to work until he found the strength to return to the stage. Music once again became his escape, carrying him far away from Maxine's temper. During this time, he crossed paths with Lynn, a fiery older woman who hired him to play at her club. What began as a working relationship quickly turned into something much more heated. Jennings thought it might be just another fling, but he soon realized Lynn wasn't going to fade into the background. By his own admission, she had him hooked. Back home, Maxine was pregnant with their fourth child, and when she discovered Lynn's phone number, the affair came crashing into the open. Jennings didn't slow down, though. In 1962, he married Lynn Jones, and the two even adopted a child together. But only 5 years later, the marriage was falling apart. Jennings was already involved with someone new, Barbara, the tall blonde daughter of a wealthy man. He even kept an apartment for her while Hugh waited for his divorce to go through. When Jennings finally married Barbara, her father promised him anything to keep her happy. But what she wanted most, faithfulness, was something Jennings couldn't deliver. Barbara wasn't blind to his ways, and she used her resources to keep tabs on him. On one tour, Jennings mixed pills and alcohol and got so out of control that Loretta Lynn had to help him sober up backstage. Later that night, he took a woman back to his room, believing she was just another admirer. In reality, she was a private detective hired by Barbara. When the truth reached her, she unleashed her fury, shredding his rhinestone suit and smashing one of his guitars. Their fights became explosive. Barbara wanted him to settle down, but Jennings refused to sacrifice his music, as he later admitted he wasn't about to quit playing guitar to save a marriage. The union ended in divorce, and Jennings threw himself even further into a wild lifestyle. Then, nearly 2 decades after his first marriage, he found someone who could match his fire. Right before his career took off, Jennings married fellow country singer Jessie Coulter. Together, they had a son, Shooter Jennings, who would go on to become a musician in his own right. The marriage wasn't without its challenges, especially with Jennings' struggles to stay faithful on the road. But the bond between them was strong. Jennings would later reflect that Jessie was the only person who could have stayed with him through it all. And this time, the marriage lasted when success became his greatest curse. Back in the mid-1960s, Waylon Jennings rolled into Nashville, chasing his shot at country stardom. For a time, he even shared a place with Johnny Cash. And just like Cash, he fell into the same habit that kept much of the music scene running: amphetamines. Juan would later admit that pills were the artificial energy that fueled Nashville day and night. Life on the road quickly turned into a whirlwind: music, endless touring, and heavy drug use, sometimes as many as 30 pills a day, mixed with a steady stream of women. Alongside Willie Nelson and others, Juan became one of the driving forces behind a new genre that would change country music forever: outlaw country. Most country fans point to Willie Nelson, Waylon Jennings, and Bobby Bare as the very first outlaws. But the name itself was first used by Hazel Smith, a country insider at Tom Paul Glazer's Hillbilly Central studio in Nashville. Outlaw country wasn't just about the sound. It was about attitude, about rejecting the polished pop country machine and embracing a rarer, more independent lifestyle. It was rebellion in the form of music. Less rhinestones and glitter, more grit and honesty. The movement caught fire in the early 1970s. Bobby Bare began negotiating control over his music while Willie Nelson returned to Texas and built a new scene in Austin. Juan, meanwhile, was writing his own hits like Good-Hearted Woman while turning other songwriters' work into classics, including Honky Tonk Heroes and Luckenbach, Texas. On May 21, 1977, Juan scored the biggest chart success of his career when Luckenbach, Texas kicked off a 6-week streak at the top of the Billboard Hot Country Songs chart. Written by Bobby Emmons and Chips Moment, the track became his most successful single, climbing not just the country charts, but also the pop and adult contemporary rankings. The song helped propel his album Juan to the top of the country albums chart for 13 weeks, and it made history as the first platinum album by a solo country artist. Ironically, despite its success, Juan never liked the song, but he admitted in his autobiography that he knew it was a hit even though he couldn't stand it. The irony ran deeper: neither of the writers had ever been to the tiny town of Luckenbach, and Juan himself wouldn't set foot there until 1997 when he performed at Willie Nelson's 4th of July picnic. His longtime drummer, Richie Albright, recalled him joking during a recording session that someone needed to remind him when picking singles that he'd be stuck singing that song every night. Juan's career wasn't just built on music and rebellion. It was also marked by brushes with danger. In 1972, at 35, Hennerly lost his life, not from drugs or the road, but from pie and milk. He stopped at a diner near the Colorado border, ignoring a warning about a hepatitis outbreak tied to local food. Hours later, he felt sick, but pushed through a show only to collapse afterward. His wife, Jessie Coulter, noticed his yellow skin, a clear sign of hepatitis, but Juan brushed it off until finally passed out and was taken to the hospital. By 1974, Juan had turned that hard-living lifestyle into music that shook Nashville to its core. His album, This Time, was one of the first to fully capture the outlaw sound. Just 2 years later, he joined Willie Nelson, Jessie Coulter, and Tom Paul Glaser to record Wanted the Outlaws, country music's first platinum-selling album. Through the mid-1970s, Juan stood at the center of the outlaw country movement, becoming its most recognizable face. But like all movements, the outlaw scene couldn't last forever. By the late 1970s, the original energy had started to fade. The pioneers moved on to new sounds and new directions. By 1979, the first wave of outlaw country was all but gone. Though its spirit, restless, rebellious, and fiercely independent, never disappeared. Still, Jennings kept cranking out hits as the years went by, often turning other people's songs into chart-topping records. But by the time the 1980s rolled around, he was facing a new and dangerous problem. The amphetamines he relied on early in his career had been replaced by white substance, and it took over his life. Jennings admitted he was blowing through about $1,500 a day on the drug, a habit that dragged him toward financial disaster. At one point, his debt ballooned to a staggering $2.5 million. The irony was that his very success was fueling the addiction. Even a drug bust in August of 1977 wasn't enough to slow him down. That night, Jennings was in the Midleaf recording session when a package arrived from his manager. He immediately recognized what it was. White substance. That he set it aside and kept working until he noticed something strange in his headphones. His sound engineer had quietly pressed the talk-back button, allowing Juan to overhear the conversation happening in the control room. The DEA was there and they were saying they had tracked a package containing drugs. In true outlaw fashion, Juan stayed cool under pressure. Sitting in the booth, he discreetly got rid of the package, then carried on with the recording session as if nothing had happened, even turning up the volume for the agents who had no idea he could hear them. He ended up using that very take on the final album. The DEA, however, had made a critical mistake. The search warrant they carried listed the wrong address. It was written for Jennings' office rather than the studio where they were standing. They were forced to wait for the correct paperwork. And while they stalled, a toilet flushed in the distance. Their evidence was gone. The case dragged on for months and cost Jennings $100,000 in legal fees. But in the end, the charges were dropped. The ordeal made headlines and even inspired one of his songs, "Don't You Think This Outlaw Bit's Done Got Out of Hand." Still, the arrest didn't stop his drug use. If anything, his lifestyle only grew more chaotic. Despite his superstar status, Juan's financial life was a roller coaster. He admitted in his autobiography that he went broke at least 3 times. At different points, his houses and properties were seized, his accounts were emptied, and his money was gone long before the profits from his albums came in. Part of the problem was the enormous cost of keeping his operation running. His team included managers, publicists, road crews, production staff, and entire convoys of buses and trucks to keep the shows moving from city to city. Add to that his white substance spending, and it was a recipe for disaster. By 1981, he officially filed for bankruptcy, reporting $2.5 million in debt. And though he somehow managed to keep performing, the drugs finally started to take their toll. In 1984 at a show in Portland, Oregon, he stumbled through his set, barely singing before leaving the stage to boos from the crowd. At that point, he was so deep into his addiction that he had stopped eating altogether. His wife, Jessie Coulter, kept him alive with protein milkshakes because solid food no longer interested him. Jennings sank into depression and desperation, but quitting seemed impossible. That's when Johnny Cash stepped in. Having beaten his own painkiller addiction at the Betty Ford Center, Cash urged his friend to get help. Jennings resisted the idea of treatment centers, having tried rehab before without success. Instead, he decided to quit cold turkey. In a final act of defiance against his addiction, he walked into the bathroom of his Arizona home and flushed $20,000 worth of white substance down the toilet. Jessie Coulter later remembered that moment as the turning point. Juan swore he would never touch it again. And this time he kept his promise. Clean at last, Jennings stepped back into music with renewed strength. Teaming up with Johnny Cash, Willie Nelson, and Kris Kristofferson, he became part of one of country music's greatest supers, the Highwaymen. The Highwaymen. Supergroups are nothing new in music. Over the years, plenty of big-name artists have joined forces to create something larger than themselves. Most of those legendary collaborations came out of the classic rock era, but country music had one that stood apart from the rest, the Highwaymen. This wasn't just another band. It was an all-star lineup made up of 4 of outlaw country's biggest names. Johnny Cash, Willie Nelson, Waylon Jennings, and Kris Kristofferson came together in the mid-1980s and reshaped country music in a way nobody saw coming. Their debut album, Highwaymen, released in 1985, went platinum and introduced audiences to a collaboration that was as much about brotherhood as it was about music. Over the years, they would release more albums, tour together, and even star in the made-for-TV movie Stagecoach. The idea sparked in 1984 during the taping of Johnny Cash's Christmas special in Switzerland. After the show, the 4 men ended up back at the hotel trading songs and having fun. In that moment, they realized how natural it felt to make music together. What's surprising is that despite their reputations, they weren't all lifelong friends. Cash and Juan had been close since the 1960s, and Kristofferson was like family to Cash, but Cash and Willie had barely known each other before that Christmas special. Still, the chemistry clicked immediately. Roseanne Cash would later say that the Highwaymen were born out of friendship, not marketing. These were men who had shared struggles, battles with addiction, and long nights on the road. Juan and Cash had even been roommates years earlier, hiding their drugs from each other. When they came together, it wasn't about chasing a trend. It was about making music with people who understood each other. At one point, the group could have included a fifth member. Merle Haggard revealed years later that he had been invited to join but turned it down. Meanwhile, Cash himself was going through a low point in his career. His records weren't selling the way they used to, and he was searching for a spark. Playing alongside Willie, Juan, and Chris gave him exactly that. Finding the right sound wasn't simple. Each man had a distinctive voice, and blending them took time. That's where the song Highwayman came in. Originally written by Jimmy Webb after a vivid dream, the ballad told the story of a soul living multiple lives: a highwayman, a sailor, a builder, and finally an astronaut. Webb wrote it in the late 1970s, and while Glenn Campbell recorded it first, it didn't find its true home until Johnny Cash brought it to the group with 4 verses and no harmony required. It was perfect. Cash insisted on singing the astronaut verse, and once recorded, the track became their only #1 hit, earning them a Grammy in 1985. At first, the group didn't even have a name. Their first album cover simply listed their individual names. It wasn't until they began touring in 1990 that they adopted the name Highwaymen, inspired by their breakout hit. There was just one issue. A folk group from the 1950s had already been using the name and even filed a lawsuit. The dispute ended quickly though, with the folk group dropping the case in exchange for the chance to open for the country supergroup in Los Angeles. Behind the scenes, the 4 friends didn't always see eye to eye. Juan's son, Shooter Jennings, later recalled the small fights that broke out. Cash and Juan would go days without speaking, or the others would get annoyed if Willie had more songs in the set list. They bickered like brothers, and sometimes their differences spilled onto the stage. Juan, for example, wasn't fond of Kristofferson's political speeches during concerts, though their bond offstage kept any real tension from lasting. The Highwaymen's second album, Highwaymen 2, couldn't quite live up to the success of their debut. Then came their third project, The Road Goes On Forever, and that one did even worse. After that, their run in the studio came to an end. The surgery that changed everything. White substance takes a brutal toll on the heart, and Waylon Jennings learned that firsthand. Although he quit the drug in 1984, the years of abuse had already left their mark. In October 1988, doctors had to perform a balloon angioplasty to clear a blocked artery. Just 2 months later, while traveling on his tour bus to a show in Tennessee, the 51-year-old singer was hit with severe chest pains. His driver quickly rerouted to Baptist Hospital in Nashville, where doctors discovered 3 partially blocked arteries. Jennings underwent an immediate triple bypass surgery. He was fortunate he had never suffered a heart attack, and with rest, he made a full recovery. Still, the surgery forced him to make major changes. He led 2 months of concerts and was ordered to overhaul his lifestyle, giving up cigarettes after more than 4 decades of heavy smoking, sometimes as much as 5 or 6 packs a day. White substance had done more than damage his heart. The stimulant had stripped away his appetite to the point where his wife, Jessie Coulter, often resorted to feeding him milkshakes just to get something into his system. After kicking the drug, his hunger came roaring back and the pounds began to pile on. Jennings later admitted that once he started gaining weight, he couldn't stop. By the early 1990s, he was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, a condition that often develops in older adults carrying extra weight. The disease left his body struggling to regulate blood sugar and carried serious risks for his kidneys, eyesight, and circulation. As the decade wore on, Jennings began slowing down. His health was failing and he wanted more time with his family. In April 2000, he underwent surgery to relieve the chronic pain he was living with. But the decline continued. Still, even with illness hanging over him, he had one last major performance to give. In January 2000, Jennings returned to the legendary Ryman Auditorium in Nashville for what would become his final major concert. Backed by the Waymore Blues Band, the group he proudly called the band he had always wanted. He was joined on stage by his wife Jessie Coulter along with Travis Tritt, Montgomery Gentry, and John Anderson. The performance, recorded over 2 nights for the concert film Never Say Die, the final concert, showed a more subdued Jennings than in his prime, but his presence was undeniable. He revisited classics like I'm a Rambling Man, Good-Hearted Woman, and I've Always Been Crazy before closing with Never Say Die and Going Down Rocking. It was a farewell true to his outlaw spirit, independent, fiery, and on his own terms. Even as he continued to record and make occasional appearances, diabetes kept taking its toll. In December 2001, after surgery to improve circulation in his leg failed, doctors were forced to amputate his left foot. That same year, Jennings received one of country music's greatest honors when he was inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame. After a lifetime of hard living, relentless touring, and a battle with his own vices, Waylon Jennings passed away in his sleep from complications of diabetes on February 13, 2002. He was 64 years old. At 63, Waylon Jennings revealed the truth about Buddy Holly's death. It has been more than 60 years since the tragic plane crash that claimed the lives of Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, and J.P. Richardson, better known as the Big Bopper. Over time, the number of people who actually lived through that night has dwindled. But for those who did, the memory never faded. For some, it was nothing more than fate. For others, it became a lifelong burden. One of those people was Waylon Jennings, who later became a legend in his own right. Jennings, who passed away in 2002 at the age of 64, carried the weight of that night for the rest of his life. In 1999, during an interview with VH1's Behind the Music, he spoke openly about the guilt that followed him after the crash. He had been a close friend of Holly and even played in his band, which gave his account a raw sense of gravity. The last words he exchanged with Buddy haunted him for decades. Jennings admitted that he blamed himself for years, believing that something he said might have played a part in Holly's death. The guilt ran so deep that he walked away from music altogether for a time. He couldn't bring himself to pick up a guitar and his grief left him hollow. Eventually, he began the slow journey back. He returned to Texas and then to Arizona, where he formed a new band, the Wailers. This fresh start marked the beginning of the outlaw country movement that would make him one of the most influential artists in country music history. Even as he built a legendary career, the memory of that night in 1959 never fully left him. It was a shadow he carried quietly, a reminder of the twists of fate that changed the course of his life. By finally sharing his story, Jennings seemed to find a measure of peace, as though lifting the burden just enough to keep moving forward. When he passed away more than 4 decades after the crash, fans of both Jennings and Holly took comfort in the idea that the two friends might have found each other again, reunited beyond the weight of that long-ago tragedy.